Hey, let us bow our heads. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who has revealed yourself through your servant Moshe and Yeshua our Messiah. As we study Vayekhel tonight, touch our hearts. Reveal the path you have made for us to walk in, and remove all rebellion that might be in our hearts, so that we may bring joy to your heart. We are willing for you to change our thinking so it becomes yours. Teach us and we will learn your ways. In Yeshua we claim your promises. Amen. When you read this parsha, it feels a bit like deja vu. It's a repeat of what God was telling Moses just a few weeks ago in Teruma. You've heard Gordon use that phrase, repetition and enlargement. Well, this parsha is a bit like that. It builds upon Beshalach, Yitro, and Kitisa in its opening verses, which focus upon Shabbat. And it builds upon Teruma when studying the latter portion. Now, when we look at the nutshell view, we see that Moses assembles the people. That's similar to previous events. Moses repeats the fourth commandment. He asks for donations of the required materials for the Mishkan, or the tabernacle. The craftsmen inform Moses that there's been more materials donated than they could possibly ever need. And then we see that the craftsmen to whom God gave wisdom organize the laborers, and they make the necessary components for the tent and its courtyard. And then we see them accomplishing their tasks very efficiently. Well, there are three elements that we see repeated. First, there is the Sabbath, which has been already mentioned in three separate passages already in Exodus. Then there is the request for donations. Finally, there's the actual building of the Mishkan. In this study, we'll look at Shabbat, since it's emphasized first, which is unusual for me. I often go for the last thing that was mentioned, but tonight I'm going to go for the Shabbat. And the look at the donations and the building of the Mishkan will just have to wait for another year. The next time, maybe if I get the opportunity to cover this parsha again, maybe I'll focus on that the next time. Interesting thing is Shabbat is mentioned 11 times. The word Sabbath appears 11 times in the book of Exodus. And that's in its singular form. It also appears in its plural form, but I didn't mention all of those because I was just doing a search for Sabbath. It appears 11 times in Exodus within 4 separate passages. And while it only appears in Genesis in the creation account, it appears in Leviticus numerous times. In Numbers, it appears 3 times, and again in Deuteronomy when Moses reviews the 10 Commandments. This frequent repetition suggests that Sabbath is very important to God. So let's look at these passages that are in Exodus. The first passage is Exodus 16, verse 23 and 25. And he said unto them, this is that which the Lord hath said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and seethe that ye will seethe, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. I'm sorry I didn't get this translated into a more recent version, more modern version. This is the old King James. And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. And the it, of course, was the manna. Then we have Exodus 16, 26 and 29. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore he gives you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide you every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day. So what do we learn about the Sabbath in these verses in Exodus 16? Bake, seethe, or otherwise prepare your food the day before Sabbath. Eat what you've prepared on Sabbath. Gather 6 days, for there will be nothing to gather on Sabbath. and gather a double portion on the sixth day. Now we'll look at Exodus 20, 8, 10, and 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, or all that in them is, as it says in the King James, and rest the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. What do we learn from these verses? We're to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. We aren't to work on that day. We're not to only rest ourselves, but we're to give rest to our children, our employees, our animals, and anyone within our gates. God declares the Sabbath is a memorial of creation. Now we look at Exodus 31, 12, and 13. And the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelite people and say, nevertheless, you must keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout the ages, that you may know that I, the Lord, have consecrated you. Now, technically, Sabbath is in the plural here, which means the Lord is pointing toward those Sabbaths he is yet to introduce the people to in Leviticus. But he's already mentioning his Sabbaths. Then we look at Exodus 31, 14 to 17. You shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy for you. He who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his kin. 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. It shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and was refreshed. In this passage, the Sabbath is in the singular and clearly points to the seventh day. What details do we learn here? Those who profane it shall be put to death. Now, this is a new detail we haven't seen before. What does this mean? Cut off is a term that's associated with Yom Kippur. It's a very solemn expression. It's a most solemn warning because to be cut off is the equivalent of the second death, which John refers to in Revelation 4 times. I'm going to take us to these passages in Revelation because they point to something God is telling his people here in Exodus. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes shall not be hurt by the second death. Notice that Jesus says to us, let him hear. This reminds me of what the psalmist says in Psalm 95, 8 to 11. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion, as in the day of trial in the wilderness when your fathers tested me. They tried me, though they saw my work. For 40 years I was grieved with that generation and said, it is a people who go astray in their hearts, and they do not know my ways. So I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Then we see, blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and shall reign with him 1,000 years. Notice here that the second death has no power over a specific group of people. And also notice what the second death is. It's the lake of fire. Oh, I think I got this there. I need to read this one. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Notice what the second death is. It's the lake of fire. And who is cast into that lake? Those who are not found written in the book of life, those who were cut off. But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Who is thrown into this lake? The first one is specifically directed at one type of person, the cowardly. People can believe in God and live morally upright lives. They can even do this if they don't believe in God. They can appear godly. They might even keep Shabbat. However, when tested, their courage fails them. To gather insights into why this can happen, let's go back to Exodus 31. You shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy for you. He who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his kin. 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as in a covenant for all time. It shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and was refreshed. Notice God says 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Is God being harsh, or is there a message for us here? Look at the context. Keeping and observing the Sabbath throughout the ages is a sign between God and his people. It reflects back to God what his people think of the covenant he's made with them. Notice that God repeats the reason he gave from Mount Sinai for keeping the Sabbath. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and continues with, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and was refreshed. This gives us the promise that we will likewise be refreshed if we remember the Sabbath. Notice also that the sign is for all time. And then Exodus 35, 2-3. On 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on this Sabbath day. Now we finally come to the mention of Sabbath from this week's parsha. Again, we see the warning that anyone who works on Sabbath shall be put to death, and that kindling of fire is considered work. Now, the rabbis noticed that Exodus 31, 1-10 precedes Exodus 31, 12-17, which gives the instructions for how to build the Mishkan. So they concluded that these verses tell us that the activities preceding these instructions to keep Sabbath tell us what we should consider work. And these activities include sowing, plowing, reaping, binding of sheaves, threshing and winnowing, separating fit from unfit crops, grinding, sifting, kneading, baking, shearing wool, washing it, beating it, dyeing it, spinning it, weaving it, making 2 loops, weaving 2 threads, separating 2 threads, tying, untying, sewing 2 stitches, tearing in order to sew 2 stitches, trapping a deer, slaughtering it, flaying its skin, salting its flesh, curing its hide, scraping its hide, or cutting it up. Writing 2 letters, erasing 2 letters in order to write 2 letters. Building, tearing down. Extinguishing a flame, kindling a flame. Beating it with a hammer. Moving from one domain to another, from one community to another is another way to put it. This list reflects the largely agricultural and hands-on world of the past. You had to work to light a fire. You had to grow everything you ate, or you starved. You sheared your own sheep and wove things from it after you carded it and made it into yarn. If you hunted, you had to do a bunch of things to make every part of that deer useful to you. And if you want it to last, you would salt it. So all of these things kind of make a lot of sense.
Can I ask, is the 2 letters 2 full letters or 2 letters like AV?
I think I didn't research it, but I gather that it is two like AB. I don't think it's like when we write letters.
Of course, that's rabbinic rules.
Right. And I recognize that. But but I wanted to lay it out there so we know what it looks like. Anyway, you can see why Sabbath was a much welcomed break from a lot of drudgery. I mean, look at it this way. Even writing was work back in those days. What did you write on? If you wrote on clay, you had to prepare the clay and you had to stamp it. If you wrote on a hide, you had to prepare it. You had to make it, whatever animal skin it was, it had to be prepared so that you could write on it. There was a lot of work. If you, after the invention of papyrus in Egypt, you could write on papyrus if you lived in a place that could produce it. That you even had to make the ink, and you had to make the quills that were used to write with. So writing was a lot of work back in those days. So I can understand why it showed up on the list. Today they don't seem like anything at all to us, most of these things, we don't even do most of them. But that's why I've decided to add a more modern list. Earning one's livelihood, engaging in business or commercial transactions, shopping, performing strenuous physical exertion, repairing, improving, constructing, or destroying, making preparations during Shabbat for events that will take place after Shabbat ends, engaging in any activity that constitutes drudgery, allowing oneself to be preoccupied, distracted, or anxious about any of the above, to be angry, hateful, grieved, or despairing about anything at all, defiling, profaning, or cheapening the precious holiness of Shabbat by word, deed, or thought. When you look at that list, it becomes a lot more difficult to say I've never broken Shabbat, broken the Sabbath, because especially these last three, to become preoccupied, distracted, or anxious about anything. It does point to, the concept of Shabbat in the Jewish mind is not about things you don't do, but who you focus on, and the promises of God, the fact that you can trust him. Whether the rabbis drew the 39 prohibited Sabbath labors correctly from Exodus 31, 1-10, or not, is a matter of personal conviction. There is this core concept that's underlying the concept of work. It's this: Sabbath was to be a day of rest because Israel worshiped the God who was their creator. And in Deuteronomy, Moses gave 2 additional reasons to observe the Sabbath when he rehearsed the 10 Commandments. And that is why the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy aren't identical to the 10 Commandments that were spoken from the top of Mount Sinai. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So the first difference is that Moses focused on the fact that anyone who became a slave in Israel could never be forced to work on Shabbat. Shabbat was for everyone, not just Israelites. It wasn't for the wealthy. Shabbat was not just for those people who were able to take care of themselves. If you were a slave, you got Shabbat off, because it was pointing to the fact that God is eventually going to free every slave. The second is because we're never to forget what it's like to be a slave to another. For us, Shabbat is our reminder that God desires to free everyone from the house of bondage with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. There's no exception. And so when we embrace Shabbat, it's our opportunity to also remember that we're constantly under the threat of becoming slaves again to the evil one in this world. He is aggressive. He does not want us to retain our freedom, but we serve a God who will not and we serve a God who will not force us to follow him. He will not make us do what he wants us to do, but he invites us to remember that Shabbat is this weekly reminder that we rest in him all the time. He is the one we rest in, even though we have to go out and earn a living, or, we have health issues that have to be taken care of, or, it doesn't matter what it is. He is our God 24/7. But on Shabbat, we have the opportunity to really rest in the truth that he takes care of us all the time. And we have a ministry of reconciliation to others to invite them to come into his rest. And so that is what I got out of this parsha this week. Let us bow our heads. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, who has revealed yourself through your servant Moses and Yeshua our Messiah. We pray that what you have touched our hearts with tonight will lead us to reach out to others with the promise of your Shabbat, to invite them to enter into your rest, to enter into what they have in Yeshua, our Messiah, because you have given him to us to share with others. We thank you and praise you. Amen.